Welcome, this is the screencast for lecture number 4, which is about death. And we started off this lecture by looking at how death at work has changed historically, and just quickly looking at how people died from work in pre-industrial eras, which would usually be through a death brought about by nature. In industrialism, you started getting much more deaths caused by machines and by artificially fabricated nature. That came about with industrialism. And then what is death in post-industrialism? This is our main theme for this this very lecture, and as we will look at in more detail in a little while, you could think about death not just as dying from an accident, but a kind of emotional or even spiritual death. We'll come back to that in a sec. So we just looked at a bit of statistics here. I'll go through it quickly here. Started doing the statistical surveys relatively late in the mid-1980s, and the occupations where more people die would usually be mining and jobs. I can't take that from the start. So here we just looked briefly at some statistics beginning in 1984, and the occupations which were more dangerous was mining, construction, agriculture. And I was just asking you a question here, which of these occupations is more dangerous today? And it is truck drivers, and you could see at any kind of drivers is going to be exposed to a much greater risk of death than most other occupations. And here you can look at the development at death at work in a UK context, and you can see it's a steady decline. And the UK has a very low, in relative terms, a very low rate of occupational death. And I was asking here, the US is having much more. Then we're looking at China and then Bangladesh. And there's a video that you can find on the blog which is about one of the more recent accidents in a Bangladesh factory, but that is the place where you find most people dying from work. And just looking at some more statistics here. If you want to look at this, you could just pause and write them down. And here's I
can't think of a product that...
Here we were looking at suicide, and an important thing is, why would people commit suicide? And there was a number of journalists. You could read more about this in the chapter from the book I wrote with Peter Fleming, Dead Man Working, chapter number 6, called The Big Exit. We try to go into this into more depth. But the idea is that in places like Foxconn and elsewhere, work becomes so present and it's so difficult to think about anything outside of work that suicide becomes the only option. And this is a quote from some journalists that went into work undercover. And people could just never switch off. They could never switch off. Work never stopped. And that's an important key theme to this entire topic. France Telecom is another example of which you could also think of a kind of post-industrial form of death. So a large number of people committed suicide, and many of them were transferred within the organization. And France Telecom was huge, so it could be being transferred to places that would be hours and hours away from where you would normally live. And there's a very good clip here that I'm going to put on the blog that you could watch.
So Mr. Ox, let me...
And these are all of the occupations that you see here: elementary teaching, cook, clerk, postal workers. They're all underrepresented, except for the artist. who would be, together with dentists and some others, the occupational groups which are overrepresented. And I was making the claim, and you could read more about this in Dead Man Working, that what's interesting with artists is that they usually work under very precarious and unstable circumstances, and that is a form of existence that is becoming more and more common among people in other occupational groups, that they will not be able to find job stability and security, but that they are constantly under pressure to produce and constantly under a threat that things could suddenly that they could suddenly lose their job or lose their income. And this is where we start to talk about spiritual death. Again, this is a quote from the first chapter of the book. So for this topic, we are using the first chapter and the last chapter. And then here you read a piece called Dreaming in Code, and I'm going to put it on the blog as well. But I think that's a really good example of someone for whom work has become so central that there's no way for this person to ever escape from work. So even in sleep, even dreaming, it will all about work. So he's working, he's sleepwalking. The only time he feels any sense of liberation or freedom is on the onset of the flu, as he says. But have a look at this reading. It's very helpful if you want to think about this kind of spiritual death brought about by work or too much work. I just asked, and some of you, many of you had done it on a few occasions, but a few of you said you were doing it very often. And then we look at karoshi, which literally means death from overwork, and there are a few news articles you could find on the blog looking at this phenomenon. There's not been a lot of research on this, so but you could look at the articles, and I started off with some cases here. These were people from Taiwan, but it's a Japanese word and it's common in Japan, Taiwan, also in China.
Wang
And this
Qimei
is a
helps her 40-year-old
clip that you
son
could watch
grow
in
out of
full
bed, as she
at
has
the
done
blog.
every day for the past.
So just some facts here. There's a word in Chinese as well, which is gualaosi, and yeah, you can read more about this in the articles that are being attached. Now we're looking at death here more as a sort of cultural phenomenon, and many people say that death today is something we cannot talk about. We, in the Western world, are very ill-equipped at talking about this. We get really embarrassed or really awkward and don't really know what to say. And I just showed this clip, which is from a small television series I did a few years ago,
been a taboo,
and you
or
can
is it
see this in
more
full
emblematic,
at the blog.
specific for our time?
But that's the
It's
philosopher
specific
Simon
for our
Critchley
time,
talking
when
about
we,
death as a taboo. And then we're calling this into question, is it really a taboo? And there's a reading attached on the blog which is calling into question, are we really not capable of talking about death? Because, you know, if you look at popular culture, we seem to be quite obsessed with death. 6 Feet Under all being about a family in the and arranging with funerals, a funeral service. And this whole topic is, I mean, death is a philosophical topic. And this is something you could read more about in the extract from Simon Critchley's work. To learn how to die is to unlearn how to be a slave. So Montaigne says, philosophy is about learning how to die. And what that can help us with is to produce a sense of produce an experience of freedom. So if we could acknowledge the fact that our time is limited, that we are human beings that are going to die one day, this is going to be extremely helpful for us to learn how to live, and to learn how to live in freedom rather than live as slaves. That would be Montaigne's argument. Heidegger's argument isn't all that different, and there's a reading attached as well, which goes through his views in a good way. But for him, the death is always your death. It is something that has to be the moment where you realizes that you, in a way, are the master of your own life. So by acknowledging death, that could help you understand that the choices you make in your life are your own choices, and those have to be authentic. Not inauthentic, and they should not be inauthentic in the sense of following what other people would tell you to do normally and being conformist, but to face up to the fact that we are mortal human beings and then try to live in as authentic a way as possible. That, in a nutshell, is what Martin Heidegger is arguing. So now, how is this relevant to organization studies? And we'll look briefly at our 3 works. Again, all available on the blog. And this is an article which is trying to look at Heidegger's thought and see how this could be really key for understanding organizations and how people are thinking about their lives in organizations. And I was stressing this also in the lecture, that this is an unexplored topic. I mean, it's not a right or a wrong answer what it means, but if you go through the reading and you understand what we actually, I mean, death is a very it's a very central topic in work today, as we were seeing before, with people dying from overwork or people just being spiritually dead. And people like Heidegger would help us understand how maybe we could live a more authentic life, even in organizations or outside organizations. So, in any way, not letting external things push you down in the way that it could sometimes do, especially in organizational settings. You can see some links here as well with normative ideologies that we looked at before. A normative ideology being something taking place in an organizational setting where people are being not coerced, but they are more or less being forced to be people that they feel are not themselves, personas that they find inauthentic. The second reading we looked at is by Hugh Wilmot, and he looks more about the death as taboo thing. He says that for us to understand sociology and for us to understand organizations, we have to understand death. I mean, this is a key point for projects of self-identity, and we have to be aware of these things. So in a sense, relatively similar to the previous reading. The last one, which I think is interesting, is probably Banerjee, who would say that actually the corporation is from the very start implicated in death through slavery, through hostile corporate takeovers and other things. And there's also a reading here that you could find on the blog from a book called Dying. And there's a chapter there on work and death. And they're looking also at organizations who are producing products that kill. You could think of tobacco industry, you could think of people producing military weapons, and you could think of even some medical companies would be involved in the business of life and death. So he's looking more at the sort of political side of organizations and how they are involved in violence, dispossession and death, and how this has been the case already from the very first forms of organizations. And you could find his reading on the blog as well. And that's it. Thank you for listening.
After all, there are worse things in life than death. I mean, if you've ever spent an evening with an insurance salesman, you know exactly what I mean. The key here, I think, is to not think of death as an end, but think of it more as a very effective way of cutting down on your expenses.